Welcome to Indy Talks, the monthly interview show brought to you by the Hudson Independent, most trusted news source for local news in the river towns. I'm Barrett Seaman, and my guest this morning is Mayor Brian C. Smith of Irvington, now in his fourth term as mayor of the village.
Right.
We'll get to whether or not there's going to be a fifth term later, but for the moment, let's talk about things that are of interest to the community. One of those things is following up on the village's comprehensive plan that you did several years ago. There was an effort to rezone the area on North Broadway, which is the entryway that most people have coming from the north into the village. Currently, what's on the left-hand side as you drive south on Broadway, that is on the east side, is a mixture of big sort of old estates. There's some commercial property there. There's residential property. There is Abbott House, which is a large facility for youths. What do you envision North Broadway looking like in, let's say, 10, 15, 20 years if the kind of vision of rezoning that you're looking for goes through?
I think in my perfect world, it would look almost exactly the way it looks today. I think what we found from some of the previous proposals from developers was that they, I think we found from the public discussion from some of those that came out of those proposals was that people like the way it looks now. As you say, it is the gateway. I think that you're transitioning into Irvington when you see kind of the big lawn, and the setbacks are very important. So I think one of my goals is to kind of preserve the way that that looks while allowing the property owners to have kind of a thriving rental business, because I think that's the balance that we're facing is, for years there was, especially considering, the big white house, as a lot of people call it, which was actually built in the 70s. It looks older, but it was built in the late 70s. For a long time, that was a thriving advertising firm, and it's just become harder and harder to kind of rent spaces. So I think, updating the uses, and it's also right now, that's all just zoned residential. So it's all through special permits and use variances that are, they're a little gray, so I think that does hurt the property value some. And it also just doesn't give a lot of flexibility in use, as well as kind of preserving that. I think that one of the things we talk about, and we're debating whether or not we should add back residential, because the current proposal doesn't have any residential in it, is would we really want to just have 6 or 8 McMansions there?
Which it would be if you stuck to the 2 acres zoning.
Exactly right. So I think that would definitely change the feel of when you drive into Irvington. It would kind of make it, it wouldn't be a special or a differentiated view. It would just be kind of more of the same. So I think that's something that's always been front of mind for me, is allowing the businesses the commercial uses there to thrive. And I think that's why we're looking to add, or update the uses to allow additional ones. And I think it's important for all the stakeholders, pretty much any resident or of the town, especially people that live in the area, to weigh in. Hence, we've had a very long kind of public comment process. We started back in May, and we won't end until September, the earliest. We have heard from some residents that are on Strawberry Lane, which abuts the kind of the southern border, and it's kind of a unique property because it has Abbott House in the back, which obviously has it's a very different setup because it's not on Broadway, but it is I think it's a 16-acre site. So it's the potential for development there is big. So that's going to be a tricky one, because Strawberry Lane is one way pretty much once you get past kind of about halfway up, and it's not a very wide road. It's not a very well maintained road. It's a private road, so I think it's going to require a lot of thought. And I was encouraged that we got some thoughtful comments from the residents on Strawberry Lane, kind of as a group, which I thought was very helpful. So we're going to work with them. We're going to work with the property owners, who we've heard from a couple of them, not as many as I'd like, to be honest. But I think I'm hopeful that if we have as much dialogue as possible, we'll get as close as possible to getting something that's livable for everyone.
So what are the concerns that have been expressed in these public hearings?
I would say the big one's always traffic. We have a limitation that it can increase traffic significantly, but some people are worried, what does that mean? which is always a concern. And I think too, historically there had been a lot more cars that were coming and going, especially when you have an advertising agency with a couple hundred people working there. In current years, it's been under rented, so I think people are more accustomed to the current, kind of traffic flows. So that's always been a tricky one. I think people are, they do want the setbacks. I think people do want to have residential uses as well. We had allowed multifamily and clustered single family, but maybe, just regular single family has to be added back in. We'll be talking about that in the next month or so. So I think that the biggest one is always traffic, and, kind of noise and pollution and things are kind of secondary, but, traffic is part of the noise issue. And I think we already have a traffic problem on Broadway. So, anything that adds additional traffic is just not going to be a great solution.
Right. One of the things that the new plan would allow for is an assisted living facility, which is something that there was some controversy surrounding your opposition to the last application. What is acceptable in your view in terms of an assisted living facility in that area?
For me, a lot of it is just the scale. The last proposal, like the use of assisted living, I think is actually a pretty good one because it doesn't have typically a lot of traffic. You can control when the staffing is. You can make it slightly off hours. And, there isn't a lot of cars in and out typically. I think the average age is like 85 of someone in an assisted living facility. Some of it's on weekends, which is usually, people visiting. It's typically a less, heavy traffic time. But for me, the last proposal was just simply too big. I think the term I used was that it loomed over Broadway. And I think, again, it got into that kind of welcome corridor there on the north end of town. And that was really, to me, and I think I also had seen the one that was over here in Greenburgh in Tarrytown. And it looked so big, and I just couldn't. The Brightview in Tarrytown, and I just couldn't picture that on that space, especially because I think if they had started with their final proposal and tweaked that a little bit, we could have hopefully, possibly gotten somewhere. But they kind of started too big and pared it back, and it seemed like we had gone on for far too long on that one. So I think it's really. I think what I find frustrating about assisted living, and I get it, the property is expensive, taxes are high, is they always need like 150 units, and I think that it's just too big and there's too much traffic potentially from that. So if there's a smaller model, I would be very open to it.
Are there smaller models out there?
It does seem so. There was someone was interested in purchasing one of the properties in the area we're rezoning, and they had some 85 unit assisted living facilities in Connecticut. So to me, there is a model. I mean, I don't know what the property cost was and those types of things, and I think that's part of it is that if you're going to buy a multi-million-dollar piece of property, you need more than 50 or 60 rooms. So that's been the issue. So to me, it's not so much the use, because I think it's a great use, it's just more the scaling of it and if the economics work or not.
Right. So is there a set of parameters that you would basically dictate to somebody who came in and said, look, if you want to build this thing, it's going to have to be this, this, and this?
I think the way we hope to do that is not so much explicitly saying that. We might end up putting some kind of cap on the number of rooms just to make it clear. But the way we've been trying to do it is kind of the coverage that they're allowed, which to me is the best way to do it in zoning. And you allow them to try to figure it out and work the pieces. Right. The problem with that is that it's not always completely intuitive. I'm not an engineer, I'm not an architect. I have trouble visualizing a lot of that, so we did hire a planner to help us with that. And she came up with a lot of great slides that kind of showed each property, and if you built it to the max, and if you had a 2-story or a 3-story or a 1-story, like what that did to the properties. And I think that helped a lot. I think we're still debating if the coverage is going to be 25% or 30%. And it's also although we're rezoning it as one area, each property is so different that the sizes of them are different, the topography is different, that they're almost all unique, which makes it harder to kind of do it as a whole group. Right. But I think that's the way you have to do it. So it property by property, it kind of the coverage will be different. It will look different, and so we're trying to get all those moving pieces to kind of fit and come up with kind of, again, the balance between allowing a property owner to kind of have decent value of their property with having uses and coverage that are acceptable to the residents, especially the ones that live right nearby.
Okay. One of the other uses that would be permitted under this plan would be medical office buildings. I remember one resident who was concerned that if you had a whole cluster of medical office buildings, it would really have a detrimental effect on the image of the village. Is there some sort of a quota system built in there as to how many of any one kind of thing you should have?
It's not in the zoning, but all the uses are by special permit. So I think if we saw that there was a tremendous amount of X, whatever it was, we could control that. I think medical offices too. I think the problem is if you have a dentist that has a single practice versus an urgent care,
Right.
we lean more towards the the latter, towards the former. We don't want an urgent care there because the traffic is just too high, and I think the traffic would actually kill a plan like that. But if you did have someone that was a chiropractor or a dentist or whatever, physical therapist, it'd be foreseeable that they could have, especially on some of the smaller properties, it might be a great use, where it wouldn't increase traffic that much because you can only have a certain amount per hour. So I think that it's finding that kind of balance, and I think that having the special permit gives you some flexibility in controlling that going forward.
So you could have something like a Burke rehab place that was there, which it's not like a real hospital the way of.
Potentially. I think when I think Burke, I think really big, but
Yeah.
I think I can envision
little Burke.
a little Burke, exactly. All the things I envision are small versions of things. So, I think that's getting those economics to work are always the harder piece. If you have, again, if we had the coverage to allow a 200, room assisted living, I think it'd be there tomorrow. But that's not what we're looking for.
Right.
We're looking for kind of 90 rooms or something, and that just seems to be right on that bubble of feasibility. So it's interesting.
Right. You mentioned traffic before, traffic and parking, which is part and parcel of the same
Yep.
thing. It's always been kind of as we said, the third rail of
Sure.
village politics. Recently, the village revised its parking rules, trying to accommodate as much as possible. I noticed that somebody is already complaining about the 2-hour limit on Main Street. Where do you see this headed? Is this just going to be an inexorable problem going forward?
Probably, unfortunately. I remember when I got on the board in '08, it was kind of the height of the crisis, and I remember making the observation that I can't wait to the days we're complaining about parking again because our stores are so empty. I guess I should have been careful what I wished for, but I think that parking, it's always something that kind of evolves, and I think that the only way to get this right is to keep trying to fix it. And I think little tweaks here and there, I think work for certain areas. I think we heard loud and clear from the residents that they were not being able to park on their own street when they came home. So we try to address that, and maybe it went too far one way, and we'll try to bring it back the other way, or maybe some streets are can have 6 hour on both sides rather than we kind of went with the compromise, and frankly just the easy math of half the streets 6 hour, half the streets 2 hour, and I think the impact on businesses. We've heard from, I think we got half dozen or so businesses that said that, we don't want to have to move our cars every 2 hours. Maybe there's a way we can permit them in the aqueduct lot during the day to take, at least a bulk of them. So the police chief and the village administrator have reached out to the 6 firms that reached out to us and trying to work with them on some ideas. We're open to changing some of the rules again.
Right.
So I think that we said when we did this after several years of work, and again, many public comments that we know we didn't get this right out of the gate. A lot of the parking was from the 60s, the 1960s. Things had changed a lot. I think we had changed and added a lot of spots with the parallel versus the angled versus the parallel, which is both a blessing and a curse. So I think we'll always have to tweak this. I think another thing that we're looking at always is kind of public safety. And I think, unfortunately, that actually means we're going to have to probably take away a few more spots, which is not going to make our parking situation any easier. But for visibility reasons and things, it's probably the right thing to do. But I think parking will be something everyone's going to work on forever. And most towns they don't have enough parking. I think it's something that gets kind of, maybe there's a bit of a solution if we are ever able to find a good spot for either the DPW and or the
Right.
fire department. I always thought that'd be great to have some kind of first level parking at the firehouse. So it's such a central location. But that's been really hard to find a suitable location for the DPW and
Yeah,
firehouse.
what is your process for doing that? That's been part of the plan, and everybody has this wonderful idea that they're going to be relocated, but what is the village actually doing to find suitable properties, and what obstacles are you running into?
Sure. So I think the first thing we did was, and that's about 5 years ago, we had someone come in and study the firehouse and say, what would it take to get us up to, kind of the modern codes for the firehouse? And I think the answer was about $15 million, and it still didn't meet all of the
You'd
requirements.
have to take it down and
You
restart.
pretty much would have to take it down, and it still didn't get you. It got you about 80% of the way there. So to me, that was definitely a suboptimal solution. So we actually asked them to look at potential properties for us, the consultant, and they basically just looked at large properties over a couple acres. Those are A, expensive, and B, there's not too many of them, especially not unbuilt locations. We are trying to work with Columbia University since they have such a large site that isn't necessarily used to its fullest capacity. So they might be able to accommodate us. We had reached out a couple of years ago and they weren't interested, but we're reaching out again. The school district and the village are reaching out together because the school district also lacks storage for their maintenance vehicles and things like that.
Had a little controversy recently there.
Yes, exactly right. So, again, finding areas to put up buildings that, is not easy. There's not a lot of municipal space, period. So, we're hopeful that maybe Columbia will say, geez, we do have extra room here. And they have been great neighbors. And I think recently they've had more outreach, and I know I was invited to a dinner there for the first time, ever. So maybe there's a little bit of a change, and I think we could work something out. So that's kind of the plan A.
Yeah.
Plan B is going to need a lot more creativity. I don't really even know what the clear plan B is right now. So.
Right. Every couple of years, the issue of whether or not the village should have a multi-story parking facility comes up. Is that changing? There's a law in the books right now that says you cannot have a multi-story parking facility.
I think the lack of parking will eventually bring that debate back. I've heard a lot of people say that they wouldn't. I think it depends on the details, like most things in the world. I've heard a lot of people say that I can envision it, kind of in the South Astor lot or the North Astor lot, where you kind of have maybe a second deck and you enter from Broadway.
Right.
And so I think that depending on what it is exactly, I think people would be open to it. I think it was just at the time, the project down on the waterfront that was going to kind of allow this to happen was such a hot button, such a controversial project that was kind of hastily put on the books. So I think it's something that will probably come back. I think too, if the DPW garage is moved from that location, I could see maybe parking under a building or something like that. So I think that it probably will come back, and I think that the attitudes have changed somewhat. I'm sure there's some people that are still against it. But I think the idea of a Pandora's box of parking facilities in Irvington is probably slightly overstated.
Right. Bridge Street Properties, which owns the Trent Building and around there, has been trying for years now to get a parking lot down there for the people who work in those buildings, and against very vociferous opposition from the people who live just to the east of that. Has there been any movement on that at all?
We had another proposal. It's hard, as you say, it's been going on so long. I think it was in the early spring that proposed giving doing a land swap, because the village owns a tiny piece of land, kind of right where the parking area would be, swapping some of the land on the very southern piece of where the original proposal was going to be, kind of the wooded area, with the village, and allow it with the theory being, or the idea being, that we could build some affordable housing there, which would create kind of a residential buffer between the commercial area and the current homes. We haven't really. I mean, we looked at it. We liked the idea because I think it would be nice just for everyone involved to have this be done. We looked at the piece of property. It is very hilly. It wouldn't be an easy thing to build on. And it's also not very large, so you maybe could get two-family homes, which isn't bad. I mean, it'd be great to have 4 more units in town, but I think it's not a slam dunk, and I think that's part of it, is that we have to really look at the piece of land that we'd be getting, the possibility of having that developed. Because I think the village would have to be involved, because it wouldn't be like a super appealing project for a developer, because it's not going to be a big money maker.
Right.
So I think the village would somehow have to be involved in it directly, which we haven't done before. So it's still a possibility. It's still out there, but it's not likely, or it's not going to happen in the near term, because I think there's a lot of question marks. But it's still out there.
Normally, when affordable housing units come up, they come up as part of as an attachment to a larger development where the developer's going to make some money anyway, so he's willing to concede
Yeah, exactly
this.
right.
This doesn't have that at all. So.
No, this will be a standalone kind of two-family and two families, and it's that just fits on that piece of property, probably with a lot of kind of engineering work to get the piece of property ready for it. So I think there's some of the questions are: is there county money or state money to kind of do some of that, the engineering work, and then could you find a developer that would want to do it? Maybe as part of another project, who knows? But so there's a lot of. It wasn't like an easy thing to view and say, this is a slam dunk, let's get that done. Right. So I think it's still an intriguing thing, because we're always looking to add parking and affordable housing. So and I think too the fact that they're willing to make everything smaller helps with the neighbors. I don't think the neighbors will still be happy, but I think that less neighbors. I think in the latest proposal, only one neighbor would be looking directly at the parking area, which would still be sunk down, so they wouldn't really be looking at it directly. But there'd only be one building across the street from the parking area. So it's changed a lot, but it seems to continue to go on and on.
Right. You mentioned the county earlier. The county seems to have given the village and all of the villages a pretty substantial windfall financially because of the increase in the sales tax. Some $286,000
this year,
and
it's
this year
almost
alone.
$350,000 next year. Yeah, this year is a complete windfall, because we obviously didn't budget for it. I think my understanding is that the whole idea was to offset property taxes, and kind of spread it out, and you have, at least in theory, people from outside the area going to be spending the money that money would come back to us, so we can keep property tax increases down. I think that it's a great theory, and I hope that we are very disciplined with the money that's coming in, that we use it to either offset things we're going to have to buy anyway, and not just use it as kind of a windfall and add programming. When I looked at it, the thing that's great, the nice thing about it is, typically our increases when you add healthcare increases and retirement increases is about that amount of money. Probably a little less, maybe $250,000, $300,000, depending on the year.
So it's disappeared already.
So it's pretty much used up. But it's nice that that's going to offset those increases, at least for 1 year. But I think that it's sad that we can't somehow get our healthcare costs under control, because they go up between 7% and 15% every year, which is it's going to be it's very close now to being. I think it's the second largest cost in the village after salaries. So. And that one just continues to skyrocket.
Sure. And it goes on well beyond their employment life.
Absolutely right. Well, into retirement now, people, if you're a police officer and you get on at 22, you can retire at 42, and you can easily be outside of the workforce longer than you were in it. So.
Right, exactly. You mentioned property taxes. That's the other part of that formula. George Latimer has instituted, with the help of the state, a 2-year freeze on property tax rate increases, as I understand it. Is that your understanding? And how is this going to actually have an impact in a village where property values go up, and therefore, whatever the rate, the taxes are going to go up?
Yeah. I'm not sure how that's all going to work, to be honest. The property, the 2% property tax cap wasn't ever really a property tax cap. It was, it was kind of expense cap. So you could have potentially, you could be within the tax cap and have a 5% tax increase. So it's going to be harder to get that to work, I think. But I think it's great we're talking about it. I just think we have to figure out ways to start getting, reducing healthcare costs and retirement costs and things like that you don't really have day-to-day control over. Otherwise, you're just going to be reducing services and kind of paying the same taxes, which is not what anybody wants.
Right. It's been several years now since the reassessment and its impact on property taxes, and then, of course, the removal of the SALT deduction. How do you see that impacting the village and sales of properties or people coming in
I think people coming in, I think so far it hasn't had a huge impact. I think a lot of people that are paying, $40,000, $50,000 a year in taxes are already hit by the alternative minimum tax. So I think that it wasn't as big a detriment as some people thought. I think it's you got a more middle class buyer that's been hurt more. And I think that they've always had the issue of not having enough housing stock as it is. So I think that's just gotten exacerbated. I think it has hit the higher end of the market. Even if people, I think, they must have bad tax advice. If you're paying, $150,000 a year in property taxes, you're probably not being able to deduct that anyway. But I think that's where it's been sluggish because people kind of took a bit of a wait and see. I think that the reassessment did hurt a lot of people. Because they were, frankly, underpaying for many years, and but that's what you budget to, and it's not their fault. It was sad that we couldn't get that done for 60 years, and it was pretty brave of Greenberg to finally do it. I think in the long run it'll still be a positive because people are paying their fair share. But for people that were kind of newer to town and just bought this and said this is what we can afford, it was very unfortunate. And we did have the 3-year phase-in, which is now. The last year was the last year. So, I think now is when it's really going to hit their pocketbook. So it's hard.
Dobbs Ferry says it's going to try to bury its electrical utility wires in town. This was something that Irvington mentioned as part of its streetscape kind of dream vision of what you wanted to do. What do you know about what's happening in Dobbs Ferry, and is it doable in Irvington?
I'm anxious to see how they plan on paying for it. We got an estimate of between $10 and $15 million to do Main Street.
Just Main Street
Just
alone?
Main Street alone. So I am curious to see how they're going to pay for it and how much they're going to get done. We will be actively watching because I don't think it's something you can get a lot of grant money for. Except if there's some kind of hardening again that from Con Ed or from the federal government. Maybe if hopefully not that we have some more bad storms or something. Right. But I don't see a way to pay for it. Our budget is about $16 million, and to spend almost a full year's kind of revenue on burying wires, I don't think there's a return there. It would be great if we could do it. It's just very hard.
Right. Okay. 4th term, is there going to be a 5th term?
There is. I'm on the ballot again in November. Hopefully 2 more years, and then that'll be a decade, and then we'll take it term by term. But right. I think that it's been a good run. I got a lot accomplished, but there's still some projects I'm anxious to work on or excited to work on, like the new entrance for the Town Hall Theater, which is a very exciting project that's just starting really. And there's the Matheson Park and the rule changes and things like that as well are going to be important. Right. But one thing I didn't get to talk about that is my favorite book, which is Binge by Barrett Seaman, which I thought that's what we were going to talk about for a half hour today. But luckily I read it, but I was overprepared.
Sooner or later going to go to college.
I have a senior in high school this year, so we're it's very timely.
Yes. The forearmed is forewarned.
Absolutely. But
or the other way around. Well, Brian Smith, thank you for coming on the show. It's been a pleasure and I think informative.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it and I enjoyed the conversation.